Folks, what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz changes the board entirely. Let me be very clear. Iran has now deployed a massive naval force, hundreds of fast attack craft, mine layers, and shore-based missile batteries to lock down the Strait of Hormuz, enforcing what amounts to a full blockade using the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy's perfected swarm tactics, drifting mines, and layered anti-ship missile systems, all in direct and calculated response to the ongoing United States enforcement of blockades at Iranian ports. Having been inside the system for decades, I can tell you this is no bluff, no impulsive act of desperation born from momentary frustration, but rather the inevitable escalation from the fragile and already unraveling 2026 crisis, a strategic masterstroke rooted in geography, history, and a doctrine of asymmetric dominance that Washington has repeatedly underestimated at its peril. Stay with me, because what comes next is where things take a serious turn, and the implications for President Trump's entire economic architecture, built as it is on assumptions of unchallenged American leverage over global energy flows, now stand exposed as fundamentally precarious, teetering on the edge of a collapse that could redefine not just this administration, but the broader contours of American power projection in the Middle East for years to come. But if you think that's the full story, it's not. This move by Tehran is not random aggression or the flailing of an isolated regime. It is Iran dictating terms from a position of calculated strength, leveraging the world's most vital maritime choke point, where approximately 20.9 million barrels of oil move every single day, representing roughly 20 to 25% of global seaborne oil trade and about 20% of total global petroleum liquids consumption. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and what Iran has achieved here with its so-called mosquito fleet, swarms of 40 or more fast attack vessels like the Ashura class, Paycap series, and Bog hammers, each armed with heavy machine guns, rockets, and short-range anti-ship missiles such as the Nasser, backed by Maham series mines deployable from small boats, helicopters, or even parachutes, demonstrates a level of operational maturity and tactical patience that turns conventional naval superiority into little more than a costly illusion. The logical progression is unmistakable. This is not Iran reacting to American pressure. It is Iran enforcing dominance over the narrow, shallow lanes of the Strait, where every tanker is forced into range of shore-based batteries, and where hit-and-run tactics have repeatedly proven, in both classified war games and the recent operations of April 2026, to be nearly impossible for even the most advanced U.S. forces to neutralize without sustaining unacceptable losses in men, materiel, and momentum. Let me be very clear. The context for this blockade did not emerge from a vacuum, but from a chain of miscalculations that stretch back to the initial United States and Israeli strikes in February 2026, which were intended to decapitate Iranian capabilities, yet instead prompted Tehran's first temporary closure and mining of the Strait, followed by a brief and unstable reopening under the fragile April ceasefire that Washington insisted on maintaining its own port blockades even after that tenuous truce. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that Iran's strategic patience here was not passivity but preparation. They waited, rebuilt their force posture with dispersion and redundancy, and now enforce total control over a waterway whose geography, those constricted passages barely 21 nautical miles wide at their narrowest, with shallow waters ideal for small boat operations and drifting mines, has always favored the defender who embraces asymmetry over the attacker who relies on capital ships and carrier groups. This next part changes everything, because what we are witnessing is the direct backfire of Trump's decision to double down on maximum pressure even after the ceasefire, handing Iran the ultimate leverage point at the precise moment when global energy markets were already fragile from prior disruptions, and exposing the fundamental hubris in assuming that U.S. conventional forces, even with the Fifth Fleet's dozens of aircraft, over 10,000 troops, and more than a dozen warships in theater, could somehow dictate terms indefinitely without triggering this precise counter. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and the U.S. miscalculation from the outset was profound, rooted as it was in a failure to internalize both the lessons of history. Think of the tanker war in the 1980s, where Iran's mining and swarming tactics tied down far larger naval powers, and the realities of Iran's asymmetric naval doctrine, which prioritizes volume, speed, and dispersion over the kind of blue water fleet that CENTCOM planners still seem to benchmark against in their simulations. In those early months of 2026, as U.S. and allied forces enforced their side of the dual blockade, Iran still managed to lay dozens, potentially hundreds of mines and deploy gunboats that fired directly on commercial tankers, causing oil flows to plummet from over 20 million barrels per day to little more than a trickle, and driving early price spikes to between $100 and $126 per barrel. The math is brutal, and it reveals a pattern. Washington assumed that its technological edge and overwhelming firepower would prevail in any confrontation. Yet the narrow confines of the Strait, with their shallow depths and proximity to Iranian coastal defenses, render traditional minesweeping operations extraordinarily vulnerable and time-consuming, even under ideal conditions without active opposition. Stay with me, because this is not merely a tactical setback, but a strategic reversal that places Iran in the driver's seat, controlling the global energy artery that supplies not just Asia, but the interdependent markets upon which American economic stability ultimately rests, however indirectly. What comes next is where things take a serious turn, as we move deeper into the architecture of Iran's naval dominance, which is not built around a handful of capital ships that could be targeted and neutralized in a single strike, but around a perfected asymmetric system of dispersion, speed, and overwhelming volume that has evolved over decades precisely to counter superior conventional forces. Let me be very clear. The massive naval force now deployed in the Strait consists of the IRGC Navy's thousands of fast attack craft, each capable of launching coordinated swarms armed with heavy machine guns, unguided rockets, and sophisticated short-range anti-ship missiles derived from systems like the Chinese C-802 or indigenous Nasser variants, complemented by midget submarines designed for stealthy torpedo runs in the confined waters, and an array of advanced mines, including the non-metallic Maham-2 and Maham-7 for shallow lanes, as well as the deeper water Maham-3, all deployable rapidly from small platforms that are themselves difficult to detect and destroy en masse. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that classified Department of Defense wargames have repeatedly demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of precisely this kind of mosquito fleet, with scenarios showing swarms overwhelming the defenses of an aircraft carrier and sinking or disabling more than a dozen major U.S. warships before meaningful retaliation could be organized, a vulnerability that recent 2026 operations have only confirmed through Iran's successful boarding and attacks on merchant vessels despite interdiction attempts. But if you think that's the full story, it's not. The United States possesses only a limited number of minesweepers in theater, recent reports confirming just one dedicated vessel at times. And even the full might of carrier strike groups finds itself neutralized in practice by the very geography that Iran has mastered, where shallow waters favor drifting mines that can be laid in patterns impossible to clear quickly, and where every engagement risks turning commercial shipping into collateral damage on a scale that would spike insurance premiums and deter tanker traffic indefinitely. Iran retains 80 to 90% of its mine-laying capacity despite earlier losses, a resilience born from decentralized production and forward basing that contrasts sharply with the Trump administration's public statements of confidence versus the private assessments of vulnerability that have circulated in intelligence channels for years. This next part changes everything, because what we see unfolding is not a navy that the United States can simply bomb into submission from afar. It is a guerrilla force at sea, one that turns every passing tanker into a potential target, every narrow lane into an ambush zone, and every attempted clearance operation into a protracted, bloody affair that would consume resources and political capital at a rate far exceeding any conceivable strategic gain. The historical parallel here is instructive. Just as North Vietnamese torpedo boats and mines challenged American naval power in the Gulf of Tonkin era through persistence and asymmetry, Iran has refined the same principles into a doctrine that now holds the world's energy lifeline hostage, exposing the limits of power projection when confronted by a determined defender who refuses to play by the rules of conventional symmetry. Stay with me, because the economic hammer that this blockade is now bringing down upon the United States under Trump's watch is where the strategic reversal translates into immediate, cascading pain that will ripple through American households, industries, and political fortunes with a ferocity that few in Washington appear prepared to acknowledge. The math is brutal. The disruption of 20.9 million barrels per day equates to roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply vanishing virtually overnight. And even a partial or sustained closure drives global prices not merely toward, but well beyond the $100 per barrel threshold already glimpsed in the April 2026 spikes, with secondary effects that strike the U.S. economy through imported inflation, higher transportation costs, and strained alliances, despite the fact that 89% of Hormuz oil flows toward Asia. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that Trump's policy trap is self-inflicted and profound. By refusing to lift the American blockade of Iranian ports, even after the fragile ceasefire, the administration has kept the dual crisis alive, guaranteeing that Tehran's response at the Strait remains not only justified in their eyes, but sustained indefinitely, thereby ensuring that energy costs remain elevated precisely when the White House most desperately needs economic wins to bolster domestic support. But if you think that's the full story, it's not. The transmission of this shock into U.S. consumer prices is already projecting national gasoline averages above $4 per gallon, hammering everything from commuting families and agricultural operations to manufacturing supply chains that rely on affordable diesel and jet fuel, while the global ripple effects, shortages in Asia leading to fertilizer and liquefied natural gas disruptions, given that 83% of LNG transiting the Strait heads to those same markets, threaten to tip interdependent economies toward recession signals that will boomerang back through trade imbalances and financial markets. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and the insider math is unforgiving. Every sustained $10 per barrel spike in oil adds measurable upward pressure to the U.S. Consumer Price Index and subtracts tangible points from GDP growth forecasts, a dynamic that risks echoing the 1970s-era stagflation if the blockade persists beyond weeks into months. This next part changes everything, because Trump's redux of maximum pressure, intended to coerce Iranian concessions on everything from nuclear issues to regional proxies, has instead produced the precise opposite outcome: higher energy costs fueling inflation at home, weakened alliances abroad as Asian partners face shortages and European markets absorb the volatility, and a political blowback narrative that could define the remainder of his term as one of economic vulnerability rather than the promised resurgence. Iran, by contrast, has bet on the Strait's immutable geography and its own doctrinal mastery, and the Strait is winning, turning what Washington viewed as leverage into a self-imposed vulnerability that exposes the fragility of an American economic house of cards built atop assumptions of perpetual access to cheap, secure global energy. Let me be very clear. The core revelation at the heart of this crisis, and the one that Trump's national security team either knew from internal assessments or should have known given the volume of classified reporting over the past 2 decades, is that this vulnerability at Hormuz was never a hypothetical or a bluff, but a long-anticipated scenario that U.S. policy chose to ignore in favor of escalation, doubling down on port blockades and coercive measures, despite clear warnings of precisely the kind of Iranian denial capability now on full display. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that classified war games and recent intelligence evaluations laid out this exact contingency in painstaking detail. American losses in a full-spectrum Hormuz fight could exceed 16 major warships, with mine-clearing operations in those shallow, contested waters requiring weeks or even months, even in the absence of active Iranian opposition, all while swarm tactics and missile barrages from dispersed shore positions exact a toll that no amount of air power can fully mitigate in real time. The massive naval force Iran has now surged into the Strait is not a temporary show of force, but a deliberate signal of permanent control until meaningful concessions are extracted, a position of decisive leverage that forces Washington into an unwinnable strategic bind, where military escalation promises catastrophic global pain and diplomatic retreat carries the domestic political humiliation of admitting that maximum pressure has failed yet again. The math is brutal, and it ties directly to broader miscalculations involving Israel and the wider regional escalation ladder. What began as coordinated strikes intended to reset the balance of power has instead unified Iranian resolve, hardened their asymmetric posture, and elevated the Strait from a potential flashpoint to the central theater where Tehran now dictates the tempo of any future negotiations. But if you think that's the full story, it's not. Decades of Iranian investment in Hormuz denial, spanning from the lessons of the 1980s tanker war through the development of indigenous missile and mine technologies under sanctions pressure, were treated in U.S. planning circles as mere posturing rather than the sophisticated battle-tested deterrent they have proven to be. A strategic failure compounded by the assumption that superior U.S. and Israeli intelligence and firepower could somehow bypass the immutable facts of geography and the resilience of decentralized naval forces. This next part changes everything, because what looked on paper like American strength, carrier deployments, sanctions regimes, and forward basing, now stands revealed as hubris when confronted by a defender who has turned the world's most critical maritime choke point into an extension of its own territory, holding not just oil flows, but the credibility of U.S. commitments hostage in a manner that echoes historical precedents like the British experience at the Dardanelles or the Ottoman control of the Bosporus, where choke point dominance reshaped entire eras of great power competition. Stay with me, because the new reality emerging from this blockade is one in which Iran has achieved a level of strategic dominance at the world's most vital energy artery, exposing the layered miscalculations of U.S., Trump, and Israeli policy in ways that will resonate far beyond the immediate economic disruption. Let me be very clear. Sustained closure of the Strait risks locking in oil prices above $100 per barrel indefinitely, compounding inflationary pressures across the U.S. economy, at a moment when Trump's domestic agenda hinges on growth and stability narratives, while simultaneously weakening alliances as Asian partners absorb shortages and European markets contend with volatility that could fracture transatlantic energy cooperation. Iran's asymmetric doctrine has once again neutralized superior conventional firepower, demonstrating through lived operations rather than theoretical models that small, fast, and numerous assets in the right terrain can impose costs that no great power can indefinitely sustain without broader strategic retreat. But if you think that's the full story, it's not. The outlook here is sobering, yet predictable. Prolonged disruption accelerates a global energy crisis that not only fuels recessionary signals, but also invites opportunistic moves by other actors, Russia, China, non-state proxies, further eroding American influence, all while forcing Washington toward a painful policy reversal that would require acknowledging the limits of coercion in favor of pragmatic de-escalation, a step politically humiliating for an administration that campaigned on unyielding strength. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and the strategic implication is unmistakable. The Strait of Hormuz is now Iran's ultimate deterrent and bargaining chip, one for which no easy military solution exists without inflicting unacceptable pain on the global economy, and by extension, on American consumers and voters themselves. This next part changes everything, because the choice confronting the Trump administration is binary and unforgiving. Pursue further escalation with all the risks of wider war and economic self-harm that it entails, or accept the necessity of de-escalation on terms that validate Tehran's leverage and potentially reshape the regional order in ways that prioritize realism over ideology. Iran emerges from this episode not isolated or diminished, but strengthened, more firmly entrenched as the actor capable of dictating terms at the choke point that matters most. While the United States confronts the domestic narrative of economic collapse that could define the remainder of this term and constrain future options in the Middle East for administrations yet to come. The historical parallel is clear. Empires that ignore the enduring power of geography and the persistence of asymmetric challengers have repeatedly found their grand strategies unraveling at precisely such narrow passages. And the lesson here is one that Washington would do well to internalize before the costs mount beyond recovery. If you've stayed with me this far, you now see the full picture. The real stakes behind the headlines that mainstream coverage often glosses over in favor of simpler narratives of confrontation and resolve. Hit that like button if this analysis resonates with the depth you've come to expect. Subscribe to support independent, insider-driven perspectives that cut through the noise, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you see this blockade as the turning point in the 2026 crisis that I do? Or is there another layer to Trump's strategy that I may have overlooked? Share this video with anyone who still clings to the official line or believes these events are disconnected from the broader economic and strategic realities shaping our world. I'll be back soon with more unfiltered analysis on the wider implications for U.S. policy, regional stability, and the global energy order. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical of easy answers, and remember that understanding the deeper currents of power is the first step toward navigating them wisely.